It's mid-January, and pretty soon in the United States, we're going to be getting into something called Black History Month, in which the saints of the 20th century are going to be paraded around for everybody to think about and talk about and try to emulate. Foremost amongst them will be Martin Luther King Jr., the Reverend. And because I live in a racially heterogeneous area, the city I live in is about 50% white and 50% black. And because I've lived and worked with and around black people for most of my life, since I was a little kid, I've been exposed to black people, which is not something that everybody in the United States, most white people, can say, because as we know, white people typically run away from racial diversity, and with good reason, just to be clear. But being a white Southerner, we don't always do that because we've been living around black people forever, so we're more comfortable with them. Our indigenous political situation in the South was totally destroyed in the mid 1960s through the actions of the federal government and various activists who were from the South and also from the North. The people who are most famous are a few little figureheads like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, but the people who did the most work to cause this are not well known. And they're not well known because they didn't want the publicity. They stayed in the background, they did organizational work, they provided funding, but they themselves were not on the front lines. They would have been known to academics, historians, journalists, and politicians, but as far as the public at large goes, you only get a few people like Martin Luther King Jr. or Rosa Parks, etc. So now I'd like to quote one of the favorite catchphrases, I guess you could say, from one of my favorite thinkers. Quote, "Nearly everything that the average educated American knows, so the things they believe, are lies or untruths." So I think that's true. And I think that statement is true, that most educated Americans, the things they believe are not in fact true. I made a video, but I haven't posted it, covering some of Anthony Sutton's work on the Western technological transfers to the Soviet Union. I think I'm going to redo it because after I made the video, I discovered some more material about something I talked about, so I want to make it better before I post it. But in the same way, Anthony Sutton's work revealed, what his work revealed was that Western capitalists, Western industrialists, and Western bankers were working with the Bolsheviks from day one. This is something that, every now and then I get these leftists who show up on this channel and start telling me that, I'm an illiterate right-winger and that I don't know anything, and, this not real Marxism and all that kind of stuff. But it's there from day one, and it's been shown conclusively that there's no contradiction between being a capitalist on the one hand, from let's say New York City, and being a communist revolutionary Marxist on the other hand. So this bears directly on the issue of the civil rights movement and the political upheavals that happened in the South in the mid-1960s. What I'm going to talk about here is, now we're finally getting into it, right? What I'm going to talk about is some of the information that has been known to some people since that time, but only recently has been published in mainstream books and is now available to you and I. Michael Hoffman has called this the revelation of the method. It's the idea that either the powers that be, or the cryptocracy, or the power elite, or the regime, or whatever you want to call them, are now so comfortable that they can show their hand And they don't need to do this, but they feel either compelled to do it because of their beliefs or because then it creates more power over us. Because if they're so strong that they can show us what they've been doing, then we must really be incapable of responding to it. So it's kind of a psychological trick. How this bears on the civil rights movement is a group of people who basically took control of the Martin Luther King faction in 1961 and 1962 and then gave it the money, the organizational strength, and the political connections that it needed and used from that point onward. So we're going to talk about a guy named Clarence Jones. Clarence Jones is a black man. I think he's still alive. And he became a lawyer. He became an attorney. He specialized in entertainment law. And then, through some unknown method, he got connected with an attorney from New York City named Henry Wachtell. Henry Wachtell was almost certainly a communist when he was a young man, but I couldn't run down the specific details on that. The biographical books, I think it's Branch that covers this period in his life, merely says that he was a young radical. But since he was a Jew from New York City, we know that he was almost certainly a communist, because that's the type of radicalism that was active in that place and time. I think you'd be really hard-pressed to find any young Jewish radicals in the 1930s in New York City who weren't communists. Maybe some sort of boutique socialism, of course, but that's about it. So Clarence Jones gets Henry Wachtell hooked up with Martin Luther King. Henry Wachtell then brings in several other people. Let's see here. We've got Ralph Hellstein, who's a Jewish trade unionist and labor lawyer. Theodore Keel, who is another Jewish labor lawyer. Theodore Keel is also historically significant because he, in the 1960s, helped bring a couple hundred Africans over to America to study in American universities, and one of those was Barack Obama's father. So we've got a couple other people here. We've got William Kunstler, that you might be familiar with, who is a sort of a subversive lawyer who would just support whatever unpopular cause he could find. It's really the revolutionary spirit, very, very strongly being active there. Henry Wachtell himself started a nonprofit organization called the Gandhi Foundation, which collected huge amounts of donations for Martin Luther King to fund his organization. Where'd the money come from? Well, Henry Wachtell, after he was a young radical, probably a communist radical, became a lawyer for industry and capital. So you now have a connection between the industrial capital world and King's organization. And so this was used by Wachtell through the Gandhi Foundation to get funding for King's activity. Henry Wachtell also knew a guy named Abe Fortas, who himself was a Jew and was appointed by Lyndon Johnson to the Supreme Court. So now, through Wachtell, you've got the connection that gets King into the White House. This is King's political connections, so it all goes through Wachtell. Now, this group, there's another group also involved. This is the more actually active communist group, and this does not go through Wachtell, but there's Stanley Levison. He was a Jewish communist who worked for speech writing and organizational things for King, and he has become controversial, or was controversial at the time, because the FBI in the 1950s had some evidence that he was deeply involved in the Communist Party, particularly through finance. Now, in 2016, a guy named Toby Terrar, T-E-R-R-A-R, wrote a paper criticizing a recent biography of Stanley Levison. The biography was written by a Jewish rabbi, I think, and Toby Terrar was criticizing the biography, saying that this guy, the biographer, Kamin, K-A-M-I-N, was trying to protect Stanley Levison by making him anti-communist, both for religious and ethnic purposes. This is what was alleged. Terrar then goes through a detailed description of, or more detailed biography of the truth about Stanley Levison. And the truth is that Stanley Levison was not just a member of the Communist Party and not just a financier, but his material success in life, because Stanley Levison came into some money. It was actually money that was given to him by the Communist Party for him to invest in businesses, the profits of which he could later turn over to the Communist Party when and if it needed those funds. So basically, the Communist Party took its total amount of money in the United States in the late 1940s, early 1950s, which amounted to something like $7 million. I repeat, amounted to $7 million. This would be over $80 million today. It distributed this money amongst its leadership. The leadership then put this money into their own pockets and bought businesses or real estate or any kind of capital. And then when the Communist Party would need funds, they would liquidate the thing that they had purchased and turn the money back over to the party. So it's a criminal conspiracy. It's a criminal conspiracy in violation of every kind of U.S. tax law or anything else. And as far as I know, no one was ever prosecuted for this activity. So that's the source of Levison's money. He basically drops out of the Communist Party and keeps the money, but ends up giving substantial amounts of it to the King organization, or at least using his own finances, which are communist-based, to help the King group. Okay, so he's part of this other group that's separate from the Wachtell group, but there are some parts of the King biography. Let's see if I can find it here. Give me just a moment. Okay. This is from Taylor Branch's Pillar of Fire, America in the King Years. Now and for the rest of King's life, Wachtell was to be called Stanley Levison's twin by Negroes of the inner circle, who quipped that the only white advisors to King were interchangeable Jewish lawyers from New York. You could not tell them apart, went the joke, which extended to a supporting confusion between their wives. So, what we've got here is the part of the story that has never been told. You have two groups of people who are supporting Martin Luther King. It is communist sympathizers who are now affiliated with industry and the legal profession. That's the Wachtell group. And then the Levison group, which are basically still communist for all intents and purposes and are so deep into the Communist Party that it's unbelievable. Along with the Levison, in the Levison group, there's Bayard Rustin, who is a black homosexual who stopped being a communist and a socialist and became a neoconservative and also converted to Judaism. And then Jack Odell, real name Hunter Odell, who was another black communist who was kind of blackballed along with Stanley Levison. So the FBI was all over these people. But they weren't really, they weren't on the Jewish lawyers. They weren't on the Jewish capital industry lawyers. So what I wanted to, another thing I wanted to read you here was, okay, so he had, let's say that King had these people around him, but how influential were they really? I apologize. I have to find my place here. Okay, Levison shuddered at seeing Rustin fall in with this group, so there's even a distinction between Levison and Rustin because Rustin is all ready to go towards the neoconservative trend, and Levison is still basically a communist at heart, I'm sure. And then the corporate lawyer Henry Wachtell was the last SCLC insider, aside from King, to hold out for Rustin. Wachtell took over much of Levison's work for the SCLC without Levison's gentle manner. He was aggressive and connected, and he judged that King's knowledge base was sorely lacking. So now we're getting some of the truth about how this group of people interacts with Martin Luther King, who is the saint that will be promoted next month. King's knowledge base was sorely lacking. With Clarence Jones, Wachtel created a study group that met with King every 2 or 3 weeks in New York to beef up his knowledge of politics, policy, and world affairs. So, and then we'll just add, Wachtel greatly admired Rustin and consulted with him weekly, which led Wachtel to wonder if Leveson had gone back to helping the Communist Party. So everybody is a socialist or a communist or sympathetic, even if they are no longer affiliated with it. Martin Luther King does not understand politics, policy, or world affairs. He is literally ignorant on these matters. And we have to get a group of Jewish lawyers, including Clarence Jones, who's the only black in that group, to educate Martin Luther King on politics. So this flies in the face of the idea of this guy, Martin Luther King, being the prime mover, being the force. He's being directed by these people. So speaking of that, let's talk a little bit about Martin Luther King and his own personal credibility. So the FBI, of course, was trying to expose him as a womanizer, which they threatened to do. I don't think anybody today denies Martin Luther King's adulterous practices, but that's a personal issue. You know, you can take it or leave it. More important, speaking to his credibility, are the circumstances of his degree in religious studies that he took. It is now agreed by every serious researcher that Martin Luther King plagiarized his doctoral work. When an investigation into this was carried out, I think sometime in the 1990s, the university that awarded him the diploma said yes, he plagiarized it, but there was no ill intent. Perhaps he didn't just understand. And in light of his great accomplishments, there will be no further action taken, no revocation or anything like that. So you have a man, Martin Luther King, who could not successfully and independently complete his degree in religious studies, who does not understand anything or enough, apparently, about politics, policy, and world affairs, and whose political connections into the upper world, into the power elite, all come from Jewish corporate capitalist industry lawyers. So based on this, based on the funding and help from communists like Stanley Leveson, and all this other kind of stuff, it just, to me, blows up the hagiography that will occur next month and has been occurring as long as I can remember. And I make this video hoping that some black people will see this and listen to me and hear this out. Because I, as a white person and a white Southerner, have had to throw away into the wastebasket a bunch of the heroes that I grew up with, a bunch of the people that I was raised to revere from a young age. Once you actually look into them, once you find out about it for yourself, you find out that they weren't the people that you were told that they were, and it might hurt. It might hurt to give up something that you cherished or something that your parents or grandparents liked. But when the new understanding comes along and new information, you've got to revise it. Okay. Thank you for your time.